Madam President.
Senator from Montana.
Madam President, I ask that further proceedings of the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Madam President, I'd like to say a few words about the next vote, which is the Cantor Amendment. The Cantor Amendment, just to review, would give a 20% deduction to all businesses that employ fewer than 500 people. That 20% deduction is calculated on U.S. source business income and is limited to 50% of W-2 wages paid. In other words, the business must be paying at least twice the amount of the deduction of wages. In addition, the taxpayer cannot get both this deduction and the 9% manufacturer deduction. The main point being here, Madam President, that this Cantor bill is a gross giveaway. It gives businesses a 20% deduction for simply earning income. They don't have to do anything. Just earn income and get a 20% deduction. It allows businesses to avoid paying tax on about a fifth of their profits so long as they employ fewer than 500 people. That virtually is 99% of all American companies. Worse still, it provides a temporary reduced tax rate. This would incentivize business to defer making investments, hiring new employees, or increasing wages in 2012 in order to increase profits, and that's because the larger the profits, the larger the tax deduction under this bill. Rather than creating jobs or investing in business, the Cantor bill incentivizes the opposite. It incentivizes businesses to sit and wait rather than invest, nor does it make any sense to spend $46 billion for only 1 year on provision as proposed in this bill. It is a giveaway, frankly, into almost all companies, 99.6 companies in the United States. It's a hedge funds, to partnerships, to private equity firms, and I think because they will almost all employ fewer than 500 employees, it's absolutely the wrong policy for this Senate to adopt, and I move to table the Cantor Amendment. I ask for the ayes and nays.
Under the previous order, the question is on Amendment 2524. Motion to table has been made. Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka, Mr. Alexander, Ms. Ayotte, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Baucus, Mr. Begich, Mr. Bennett, Mr. Bingaman, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Bozeman, Mrs. Boxer, Mr. Brown of Massachusetts, Mr. Brown of Ohio, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Chambliss, Mr. Coates, Mr. Coburn, Mr. Cochran, Ms. Collins, Mr. Conrad, Mr. Coons, Mr. Corker, Mr. Cornyn, Mr. Crapo, Mr. DeMint, Mr. Durbin, Mr. Enzi, Mrs. Feinstein, Mr. Franken, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mrs. Hagan, Mr. Harkin, Mr. Hatch, Mr. Heller, Mr. Hoven, Mrs. Hutchison, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Inouye, Mr. Isaacson, Mr. Johans, Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin, Mr. Johnson of South Dakota, Mr. Carey, Mr. Kirk, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Cole, Mr. Kyle, Ms. Landrieu, Mr. Lautenberg, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Levin, Mr. Lieberman, Mr. Lugar, Mr. Manchin, Mr. McCain, Mrs. McCaskill, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Ms. Mikulski, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Nelson of Nebraska, Mr. Nelson of Florida, Mr. Paul, Mr. Portman, Mr. Pryor, Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, Mr. Reed of Nevada, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Rockefeller, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Sessions, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Snow, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall of Colorado, Mr. Udall of New Mexico, Mr. Vitter, Mr. Warner, Mr. Webb, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Senators voting in the affirmative: Alexander, Ayotte, Baucus, Bennett, Bingaman, Blumenthal, Boxer, Brown of Ohio, Cardin, Carper, Casey, Coons, Corker, Cornyn, Crapo, Durbin, Feinstein, Franken, Graham, Harkin, Inouye, Johans, Landrieu, Lautenberg, Leahy, Manchin, Menendez, Merkley, Mikulski, Murkowski, Murray, Nelson of Florida, Portman, Reed of Nevada, Risch, Sanders, Stabenow, Warner, and Whitehouse. Mr. Pryor, aye. Mr. Begich, aye. Mr. Coburn, aye. Mr. Schumer, aye. Mr. Lieberman, aye. Mr. DeMint, aye. Senators voting in the negative: Blunt, Burr, Collins, Grassley, Hatch, Heller, Hutchison, Isaacson, Lugar, McCain, McConnell, Roberts, and Wicker. Mr. Paul, no. Mr. Enzi, no. Mr. Bozeman, no. Mr. Levin, aye. Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, aye. Mr. Lee, no. Mr. Toomey, aye. Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin, aye. Mr. Brown of Massachusetts, no. Mr. Cochran, no. Mr. Sessions, aye. Mr. Enzi, aye. Mr. Barrasso, aye. Mrs. Shaheen, aye. Mr. Coates, aye. Ms. Klobuchar, aye. Mr. Nelson of Nebraska, aye. Mr. Inhofe, no. Mr. Wyden, aye. Mr. Rubio, aye. Mrs. Hagan, aye. Mr. Chambliss, aye. Mr. Vitter, no. Mrs. Gillibrand, aye. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota, aye. Mr. Rockefeller, aye. Mrs. McCaskill, aye. Mr. Conrad, aye. Ms. Snow, no. Mr. Webb, aye. Mr. Cole, aye. Mr. Tester, aye. Mr. Akaka, aye. Mr. Kyle, no. Mr. Soon, aye. Mr. Kerry, aye. Ms. Cantwell, aye. Mr. Udall? Mr. Udall of Colorado? Aye. Mr. Shelby? Mr. Shelby? No. Mr. Hoven? Mr. Hoven? No.
Is there any senator who has not yet voted or wishes to change his or her vote? If not on this amendment, the ayes are 73, the nays are 24. The amendment is carried. The motion is not agreed to.
Mr. President,
The amendment is tabled.
Mr. President,
Majority Leader.
yield to my distinguished colleague.
Mr. President, if we could have order in the chamber.
Senate will be in order. Republican Leader.
Senator from Maine, Senator Collins, has just passed an important milestone, her 5,000th consecutive roll call vote. A tenacious accomplishment indeed that represents the work ethic and dedication Senator Collins has for the people of Maine and for the Senate. We all know she's one of the hardest working members of the United States Senate. Now listen to this. Since she was sworn in January 3rd of 1997, she's been present for every single roll call vote. That's over 15 consecutive years of never missing a vote. Senator Collins is actually in quite an elite company. Recently, she passed Senator Byrd and is now third all-time behind Senator Chuck Grassley and the late Bill Proxmire from Wisconsin. And I know she took great pride also to be in the company of her role model, a woman that played a major role in her decision to run for public office in the first place, fellow Maine Senator Margaret Chase Smith, who is currently number 5 on the list. So on behalf of the entire Senate, I want to congratulate Senator Collins for this great achievement.
This is a remarkable accomplishment. And I hope I don't get her in trouble with her colleagues, but I really like her. She is, I appreciate her ability to work with us, work with everybody. She is somebody who you never have to guess where she stands on an issue, and I admire and appreciate her so much for that. I've worked with her on issues going back for many, many years, and I really, again, say I appreciate what she's done. She has great genes. Her mother and father each served as mayor of a small town in Maine, a place called Caribou. And I have really, Susan and I don't have fond memories of Caribou because in my, I think it was my '98 race, we were, this great mailing that we did, one of my consultants from, I worked from Nevada, that's for sure. Instead of having deer, they had caribou on my campaign literature. And it took me a while to figure that one out. But I'm sure the town of Caribou was better than my campaign spot. Her family ran a lumber business. Her father was also a state senator. I am confident that Susan has learned to be the senator she is because of Bill Cohen. I had the pleasure of serving this good man from Maine. I served on, as a junior member when he was chairman of the Aging Committee, and he was such a wonderful man. I still talk to Bill Cohen, and she has many of his traits. As we know, she worked for him. He has been a great Secretary of Defense. He's just been a good person, and I am confident that her ability to be the legislator she is and a lot of it is attributed to him. She's always been known as her ability to compromise, legislation, the art of compromise, and she works with all lawmakers. I think the tone that she has set working with Joe Lieberman is magnificent. They have run that committee with dignity and on a totally bipartisan basis. This is 5,000 votes. Frankly, a number of us have cast 5,000 votes. But it's ridiculous, the example that she has set, never missing a vote. I wish her the very best in her many years to serve in the future in the Senate.
There will now be 2 minutes of debate equally divided. Who yields time?
President.
Senator from Louisiana.
Mr. President, I think we're on the Landrieu amendment.
Senator is correct.
Mr. President, I discussed this amendment.
Senate will be in order.
I discussed this amendment in great detail yesterday, so there's no reason to review it. I want to thank many members of the Small Business Committee on both sides of the aisle for putting forth some really terrific very popular and effective ideas for small business: 100% exclusion of capital gains, decreased deduction for startup expenditures, S-corporation holding period reductions, carryback on business credits, and expensing of 179, all very familiar to this body and absolutely critical for investing in our small business. The bill only cost $4 billion compared to some of the other numbers that are being thrown around here. We think it's very cost effective, and I ask for the support of the body.
Opposition. Yield back. The time is yielded back. Under the previous order, the clerk will report the motion to invoke cloture.
We, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, hereby move to bring to a close the debate on the substitute amendment number 2521 to S-2237, the Small Business Jobs and Tax Relief Act, signed by 17 senators.
By unanimous consent, the mandatory quorum call has been waived. The question is it the sense of the Senate that debate on amendment number 2521, offered by the Senator from Nevada, Mr. Reed, for Ms. Landrieu, to S-2237 shall be brought to a close? The ayes and nays are mandatory under the rule. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka, Mr. Alexander, Ms. Ayotte, Mr. Toomey, sir, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Baucus, Mr. Begich,
There's one more vote.
Mr. Bennett,
Sir. Okay. Sir.
Mr. Bingaman, Blumenthal, Carper, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Bozeman, Mrs. Boxer, Mr. Brown of Massachusetts, Mr. Brown of Ohio, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. McCain. Mr. Casey, Mr. Chambliss, Mr. Coates, Mr. Coburn, Mr. Cochran, Ms. Collins, Mr. Conrad, Mr. Coons, Mr. Corker, Mr. Cornyn, Mr. Crapo, Shelby. Yes, sir, I did. Sir. Mr. Dement.
Are you the lady? You don't work with
Mr. Durbin.
somebody else now. Where is she?
Mr. Enzi.
Where?
Mrs. Feinstein. Mr. Franken.
Okay. Tell her I'm checking.
Mrs. Gillibrand.
Okay.
Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Mrs. Hagan. Mr. Harkin. Mr. Hatch. Mr. Heller. Mr. Hoven. Mrs. Hutchison. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Inouye. Mr. Isaacson. Mr. Johans.
Yes.
Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota. Mr. Kerry. Mr. Kirk. Ms. Klobuchar. Mr. Cole. Mr. Kyle. Ms. Landrieu. Mr. Lautenberg. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Lee. Mr. Levin. Mr. Lieberman. Mr. Lugar. Mr. Manchin. Mr. McCain, Mrs. McCaskill, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Merkley, Ms. Mikulski, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Nelson of Nebraska, Mr. Nelson of Florida, Mr. Paul, Mr. Portman, Mr. Pryor, Murray, you're on. Mr. Reid of Rhode Island, Mr. Reid of Nevada. Is he on? Sir. Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Rockefeller, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Sessions, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Snow, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall of Colorado, Mr. Udall of New Mexico, Mr. Vitter. Sir. Sir. Mr. Warner, Mr. Webb, yes. Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden. Senators voting in the affirmative: Akaka, Baucus, Begich, Blumenthal, Boxer, Brown of Massachusetts, Brown of Ohio, Carper, Casey, Collins, Coons, Durbin, Hagan, Inouye, Johnson of South Dakota, Kerry, Cole, Lautenberg, Leahy, Levin, McCaskill, Merkley, Mikulski, Murray, Nelson of Nebraska, Nelson of Florida, Schumer, Shaheen, Stabenow, Tester, Udall of Colorado, Udall of New Mexico, Vitter, Webb, and Wyden. Mr. Harkin. Mr. Harkin, aye. Mr. Cochran. Mr. Enzi. Mr. Manchin. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Menendez, aye. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Cardin, aye. Mr. Sanders, aye. Senators voting in the negative: Alexander, Ayotte, Barrasso, Blunt, Bozeman, Burr, Chambliss, Coates, Coburn, Cochran, Corker, Cornyn, Crapo, Dement, Enzi, Graham, Grassley, Hatch, Hoeven, Inhofe, Isaacson, Johans, Kyle, Lugar, Manchin, McCain, Paul, Portman, Rubio, Sessions, Shelby, and Toomey. Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, aye. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Feinstein, aye. Mr. Lieberman. Mr. Lieberman, aye. Mr. Roberts. Mr. Roberts, no. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mrs. Gillibrand, aye. Mr. Warner. Mr. Warner, aye. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin, no. Mr. Thune. Mr. Thune, no. Ms. Landrieu. Ms. Landrieu, aye. Ms. Klobuchar. Ms. Klobuchar, aye. Mr. Heller. Mr. Heller, aye. Mr. Pryor. Mr. Pryor, aye. Ms. Cantwell. Ms. Cantwell, aye. Ms. Snow. Ms. Snow, aye. Mr. Franken. Mr. Franken, aye. Mr. Lee. Mr. Lee, no. Ms. Murkowski. Ms. Murkowski, no. Mr. Bingaman. Mr. Bingaman, aye. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Whitehouse, aye. Mr. Reed of Nevada, aye. Mr. Rockefeller. Mr. Rockefeller, aye. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Bennett, aye. Mrs. Hutchison, no. Mr. McConnell. Mr. McConnell, no. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wicker, no. Mr. Conrad. Mr. Conrad, aye. Mr. Risch. Mr. Risch, no.
Are there any senators who have not yet voted or wish to change their votes? If not, on this vote, the ayes are 57, the nays are 41. 3/5 of the senators duly chosen and sworn not having voted in the affirmative, the motion is not agreed to. There will now be 2 minutes of debate equally divided.
President.
Senator from Montana.
Mr. President, I think minds are made up here. I just suggest that both sides yield back the balance of the time that we vote.
All right, without objection, time is yielded back. The clerk will report the motion to invoke cloture.
We, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, hereby move to bring to a close the debate on S-2237, the Small Business Jobs and Tax Relief Act, signed by 17 senators.
By unanimous consent, the mandatory quorum call has been waived. The question is it the sense of the Senate that debate on S-2237, a bill to provide a temporary income tax credit for increased payroll and extend bonus depreciation for an additional year and for other purposes, shall be brought to a close. The yeas and nays are mandatory under the rule. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka. Mr. Alexander. Ms. Ayotte. Get her to answer. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Baucus. Mr. Bekich. Mr. Bennett. Sorry. Mr. Bingaman. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Bozeman. Mrs. Boxer. Mr. Brown of Massachusetts. Mr. Brown of Ohio. Mr. Burr. Ms. Cantwell.
Yeah, I'd like to. Okay, Bernie. My friend. Yes, sir.
Mr. Carper.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Casey. Mr. Chambliss, Mr. Coates, Mr. Coburn. Mr. Cochran. Ms. Collins. Mr. Conrad. Mr. Coons. Mr. Corker. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Crapo. Mr. DeMint. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Enzi. Mrs. Feinstein. Mr. Franken. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Mrs. Hagan. Mr. Harkin. Mr. Hatch. Mr. Heller. Mr. Hoven. Mrs. Hutchison. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Inouye. Mr. Isaacson. Mr. Johans. Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota. Mr. Carey. Mr. Kirk. Ms. Klobuchar. Mr. Cole. Mr. Kyle. Ms. Landrieu. Mr. Lautenberg. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Lee. Mr. Levin. Mr. Lieberman. Mr. Lugar. Mr. Manchin. Mr. McCain. Mrs. McCaskill. Mr. McConnell. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Merkley. Ms. Mikulski. Mr. Moran. Ms. Murkowski. Mrs. Murray. Mr. Nelson of Nebraska. Mr. Nelson of Florida. Mr. Paul. Mr. Portman. Mr. Pryor. Mr. Reed of Rhode Island. Mr. Reed of Nevada. Mr. Risch. Mr. Roberts. Mr. Rockefeller. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Sessions. Mrs. Shaheen. Mr. Shelby. Ms. Snow. Ms. Stabenow. Mr. Tester. Mr. Thune. Mr. Toomey. Mr. Udall of Colorado. Mr. Udall of New Mexico. Mr. Vitter. Mr. Warner. Mr. Webb. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wyden. Senators voting in the affirmative: Akaka, Baucus, Beckich, Bennett, Bingaman, Blumenthal, Brown of Massachusetts, Brown of Ohio, Cantwell, Cardin, Carper, Casey, Conrad, Coons, Durbin, Feinstein, Franken, Gillibrand, Hagan, Heller, Inouye, Johnson, South Dakota, Carey, Klobuchar, Cole, Landrieu, Lautenberg, Leahy, Levin, Lieberman, McCaskill, Menendez, Mikulski, Murray, Nelson, Nebraska, Nelson of Florida, Reed of Nevada, Rockefeller, Sanders, Shaheen, Stabenow, Tester, Udall of Colorado, Udall of New Mexico, Warner, Webb, Whitehouse, and Wyden. Mr. Reed. Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, aye. Senators voting in the negative: Ayotte, Barrasso, Blunt, Bozeman, Burr, Chambliss, Coates, Coburn, Cochran, Collins, Corker, Cornyn, Crapo, DeMint, Enzi, Graham, Grassley, Hatch, Hoeven, Hutchison, Inhofe, Isaacson, Johans, Johnson of Wisconsin, Kyle, Lee, Lugar, Manchin, McCain, McConnell, Murkowski, Paul, Portman, Risch, Roberts, Rubio, Sessions, Shelby, Snow, Thune, Toomey, Vitter, and Wicker. Mr. Pryor, aye. Mr. Merkley, aye. Mr. Harkin. Mr. Harkin, aye. Mr. Schumer? Aye. Mr. Alexander? No.
Is there anyone in the chamber wishing to vote or wishing to change their vote? Hearing none on this vote, the yeas are 53, the nays are 44. 3/5 of the senators duly chosen and sworn not having voted in the affirmative. The motion is not agreed to. Under the previous order, S-2237 is returned to the calendar. The Senate resumes consideration of the motion to proceed to S-3369.
Madam President.
The senator from Louisiana.
Thank you, Madam President. Before we end the debate on the small business tax